You know, in my journey through the series, the expectations set by Dark Souls 1 and Elden Ring was, as you can imagine, pretty high. And let me tell you, after coming from those two landmark masterpieces, I was not prepared for the gaping black hole in quality that is Dark Souls 2, Scholar of the First Sin. So, let's start off with the only thing about this entry that is better than the other Souls games. You climb the ladders really fast. That is it. That is the only thing about Dark Souls 2 that's better than the other entries. Your character climbs as if they were a gerbil, lit ablaze, after being doused in 176 proof alcohol, imported from the far reaches of Bosnia, while scurrying away from a deranged Karen. As you start Dark Souls 2, what you can't help but notice is the beauty and aesthetics of the flora and fauna in the kingdom of Drangleic. The setting for the game, certainly a step up from the visuals of the first entry. The areas are richly detailed with all manners of intricate representations of Romanesque buildings, Pirates of the Caribbean-like coves and vaults, or cathedrals that wouldn't look out of place at the Vatican, and such. A shame then, that the various locales and regions are strewn about and constructed in a way which doesn't make any real sense, making them feel like Disney theme park areas or haunted houses at the local fair. Your avatar would go through one by one, as opposed to environments existing naturally within the world, like those in Lordran in the first Dark Souls, or the lands between of Elden Ring. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's a demonstration of themes over substance. As you work your way from the quaint village of Magilla, the starting hub of the game which the other zones branch out from, the first, quote-unquote, stage, the Forest of the Giants, does not feel terribly disjointed. A lush wilderness, full of coniferous trees and shrubs, complete with a crystalline creek, and as with From Software tradition, a disproportionately deadly enemy right in the beginning of the stage. A rather large, rather grey, rather monocular, and rather bipedal hippo. Dark Souls 2's equivalent of the tree sentinel patrolling Limgrave in Elden Ring. Like the Undead Berg in the original game. This opening area makes a good first impression by setting expectations of what's to come. A well-designed area, merged with well-thought-out enemy placement. Unfortunately, past these first opening stages, the game spirals into a sporadic, and not infrequent, display of nonsensical level design and placement, which shatters your immersion. Ever watched a movie where the camera cuts away from a character, then back during dialogue? Say, in a restaurant. Only then to have the actor appear with a necktie of a different color, or feasting on a lobster where before the camera cut, she or he was consuming a plate of fettuccine alfredo. This is called the withdrawal from the suspension of disbelief. The scene was shot with multiple takes over multiple days, and the prop master forgot which items were on the set. Dark Souls 2 makes the gaming equivalent of the withdrawal from the suspension of disbelief. More than occasionally will you spot a door, a pathway to a ladder, or a pickup item only acquirable by reaching the top of a ledge. A ledge that's perhaps 2 to 7 feet tall, relative to the ground on which you stand. A ledge you will not be able to step onto unless you fight your way through a combination of 3, 5, sometimes even 8 or more corridors, catacombs, or caverns, filled with all manner of attackers and animals, all leading up to a battle with some generic psycho demon. And only then does the path conveniently circle back to the ledge for you to be able to access the previously mentioned door, ladder, or pickup item. Because, according to From Software's logic, although your character has the capacity to slay monsters and demigods, It would not make sense at all for your avatar to be capable of picking up an item perched on a ridge the height of a self-assembled shelf purchased at IKEA, or to be able to step up onto a minor platform 3 feet off the ground, because that would make no sense whatsoever. And also, believe you me, you do not want to be facing off against some generic psycho demon in a tunnel at 3 in the morning. You will have nightmares for years, possibly even PTSD. Now, surely, at least the regions and locales would be logically arranged into a cohesive world. After all, the world of Lordran was the true star of the show for the first entry in the series. A textbook study of a well-thought-out environment plan, executed to near perfection, as if a mythical architect from an era bygone blueprinted an ancient walled metropolis for the ages. Surely, From Software would reprise their impeccable expertise in this sequel. Unfortunately though, they do not. Speaking of which, as an example, let's take Hyde's Tower of Flames. The picturesque, J.R.R. Tolkien world of derelict Roman architecture, rising about in vast, unending, Mediterranean Sea, is fine by itself, while battling massive stone knights and German Templar guards through the ruins. A fork in the road will eventually arrive. One path leads to a crimson dragon guarding the drawbridge to an old foe. The second, to a rather portly boss, which, were you to vanquish, reveals a structure containing a medieval wooden elevator descending to what appears to be an underwater cavern with a bonfire. Then, as you exit the cavern, you will behold a replica of the set for a rather well-known theme park ride, the Wharf of the Pirates of the Caribbean, in Disneyland. Now, I am not an oceanologist, and although many years of killing brain cells with copious amounts of legal and possibly illegal substances has impaired my ability to ascertain the nature of reality, but what I do know is to have a cabin submerged in the ocean is totally possible. What is not totally possible is to have a cabin submerged 200 feet in the sea, leading to a cove, housing a pirate's wharf, where a pirate's ship is conveniently located, and conveniently facing a large opening in the rock walls of the cove. How exactly, pray tell, does the seawater not come gushing in, as this pirate's cove should logically be underwater, as it is 200 feet lower, beneath the surface of the ocean, surrounding Hyde's Tower of Flames? And how can the sea level of the wharf be 200 feet lower than the sea level of the Roman ruins, just 600 feet away? Remember, the derelict ruins of Hyde's Tower of Flames rose about in a vast, unending, Mediterranean Sea. You should still be under the surface of the ocean. And why the hell would there be a 18th century pirate's wharf, replete with 18th century pirates, and a conveniently located 18th century pirate's ship, all inside of a pirate's cove, next to a derelict Roman ruin, beneath the ocean waves? Every environment has its own theme. Whether it's a forest, some type of fortification, or some mythically styled dream world, but not the substance to back it up. Many, but not all, of the levels are some variation of Sense Fortress from Dark Souls 1, like the Earthen Peak or the Iron Keep, while others are some variation of Blight Town, such as the Gutter or the Black Gulch. Many of the forest areas, although having the veneer of a forest, do not feel like woodland. These are more akin to linear pathways, with a mixture of large open-air rooms, dressed up with thickets and timber. You can't help but feel you're just playing a video game while working your way through the world of Dark Souls 2. Whether watching a film, listening to music, or playing a game, I turn my brain off and let the experience wash over me, to maximize the suspension of disbelief and give the product the greatest chance to convince me of the reality it's attempting to convey. In more than a few instances, does Dark Souls 2 display absurdities which goes against common sense. As such, it is truly a demonstration of themes over substance. As opposed to the Metroidvania map of Dark Souls 1, or the Zelda Breath of the Wild-like open world of Elden Ring. The game map of Dark Souls 2, if I've forgotten to mention, is an array of single direction paths, generally, from which you can select where to go. Like in a Mega Man game, but composed of multiple connected levels each, all branching out from the village of Majula. And when you've reached the end of the branch, after defeating a giant two-headed spider, the cyber demon from Doom, or Medusa, a bonfire can be taken back to Majula, after which, can you select another branch, and work towards the end of that. Defeat another major boss, and the cycle repeats. In Dark Souls 2, not only is the map design fundamentally different, but so is the feel of the battle mechanics. On the surface, it seems the same as Elden Ring, or the other entries in the Souls series. A combination of offensive shield and swordplay, intersected by defensive dodging. All of which can be augmented through point distribution of various stats as you build up your avatar. However, not long after starting the campaign, does the combat feel palpably different. The swordplay of Elden Ring, Dark Souls 1, and, I would assume, Dark Souls 3, have the same general tactile quality. With Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3 combat being versions of the swordplay in the first Dark Souls, sped up by 50%. For their second outing in the Dark Souls franchise, From Software changed the sword swing from a fluid motion to a relatively staccato swordplay animation, wherein the sword attacks are now quick strikes, punctuated by brief pauses between slashes, whether one or two-handing the weapon. Now, this could just be me, but there also seems to be a very slight, though perceivable, delay between the button press and the execution of the sword swing. It's as if, instead of consecutively moving the blade in smooth arcs, the avatar hesitates between inhumanly fast strikes, almost as if the katanas and long swords are made of half the mass you would expect them to have. This creates a somewhat jagged and unintuitive combat rhythm. So rather than having a melee system merge with your natural instincts, you need to constantly accommodate this slight disconnect between attack inputs and the actual execution of the strike. So instead of being able to put all your focus on the battle, it's another variable taking a part of your attention away from the fight at hand. Going back to the Elden Ring critique, I said, the bosses are like moving puzzle boxes with which you have to fit the pieces together while metering your limited resources. And although I haven't played through Dark Souls 2 and 3, from what I have heard, they are about the same. I was half right. In Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty, Revolver Ocelot commented to his terrorist collaborators, "You people really are the biggest freaks outside of Foxhound," as a reference of Metal Gear Solid 2's bosses as being inferior alternatives to the freak shows of the original Metal Gear Solid. I concur with Revolver Ocelot's sentiment. The bosses of Dark Souls 2, like their counterparts in the Metal Gear Solid sequel, really are just less imaginative variants of their predecessors in the first game. Most of them are just some generic monster, like a giant slug, a large blob, or some equally generic, large armor-clad knight. More memorable, for often having hitboxes larger than the weapon being swung, or for being asynchronous to the attack animation, than for their style or cleverness of the attack patterns. Speaking of hitboxes, you'll die a lot in this game. Though not because most of the enemies or bosses have nicely designed combos. but because the invisible hitboxes aren't aligned to the size of the weapons they use, or has an invisible trail, which remains after the swing, that can catch you, even if you've apparently rolled past the attack cleanly. As an example, the Pursuer, a winged flying knight, demonstrates this phenomenon quite often. It has a lunge stab, where when your roll animation clearly shows you going past him, roughly past the elbow of his sword arm. But then, you'll suddenly be teleported onto its sword, impaled, and become cursed, as well as receiving damage. It's rather unclear whether this is due to the hitbox for the lunge stab being larger than the sword, or the hitbox having a delayed timer, causing it to remain active, even though the animation has clearly ended. This makes for a rather unsatisfying gameplay mechanism, where you more often take damage or die, due to this hitbox and attack animation mismatch, than you do to clever attack patterns, since the optical information of the animation, and its corresponding effect, does not align. As with the disconnected combat feel mentioned earlier, this is another variable, taking away a part of your attention. You know, the leveling up system in this game is, quite frankly, terrible. Now, I don't mind grinding usually. It's a necessary evil for games in general. However, in this game, it really is just a thinly veiled method to increase gameplay length. Dividing the stats into this many categories, specifically, having a separate stat for equipment load, called Vitality, and a stat for how agile your character could be, labeled Adaptability, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now the former stat, Vitality. Why the hell would your avatar's ability to carry more stuff be separate from endurance? The stat is literally called endurance. But fine. Whatever. It's the latter stat, Adaptability, that ground my gears into a perfectly smooth metal coaster to rest your ice-cold Estus flask. Dark Souls 2 gives the player nearly no information about this stat in-game. Were you to look up its function online, what it does is augment the effectiveness of your rolls by minutely increasing the amount of time the avatar is invulnerable within the roll. You start off with 0.2 of a second less in roll invincibility compared to the first game, which wouldn't be too much of a problem by itself. However, reacquiring the 0.2 of a second back requires dumping 11 levels into this, otherwise mostly useless, stat. Considering Dark Souls 2 splits every ability into its own stat, it just results in a ton of grinding. Your only other incentive in up-leveling adaptability is it increases the speed your character guzzles health flasks, which, if I have not mentioned yet, is so slow, it's redonkulous. It takes 2/3 of a second longer than your character's counterpart in the first game, and reducing that time to 1/3 of a second slower than the first game, which is the maximum guzzle speed in Dark Souls 2, requires dumping 15 levels into adaptability. What the fuck? I've seen infants, here in jolly old England, down a pint of Indian Pale Ale, with greater speed than the Cosmopolitan Martini sipper. Dark Souls 2 calls your character. If you've watched 2 or more of my videos, hit subscribe and like. It really helps me to make new videos. This was a very different game, compared to Elden Ring, and the first Dark Souls, and it provided a lot to think about. I hoped it will be worth your time as well. Comment down below. And if you didn't like something I talked about, or didn't like this video essay, also let me know by commenting below. This video essay has been pretty negative, but that's only because I've zoomed in on certain features and functions that could have been more thoroughly integrated. While these flaws do deter the quality of the overall experience, it only makes the other entries shine ever more brightly. The game is worth your time for the most part, especially so, since you can pick it up at a low price. Take care and see you around.